Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to New Testament textual criticism. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this term, you might assume that it has something to do with being critical of or having a negative view of the New Testament. But that's not what it means. Textual criticism is simply the process that scholars use when trying to figure out the original wording of an ancient text, in this case, the New Testament. As you probably know, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and therefore all English Bibles are just translations. However, a lot of people assume that if they were to pick up a Greek copy of the New Testament, they'd be holding the original words in their hands. Well, it's not actually that simple. You see, there are no original copies left of any New Testament book. All we have are copies of copies of copies, etc. And the thing is, when you compare the various Greek copies of the New Testament that we do have, even the really old ones, there are some differences. So the question comes up, which copies are the closest to the original? Well, that's where textual criticism comes in. Understanding at least the basics of textual criticism is important for any serious student of the Bible, Christian or non-Christian. For example, it helps one better understand the footnotes found in most English Bible translations. Until recently, there were not really any good charts out there for explaining the fundamentals of textual criticism. However, there is one now because a colleague of mine named Stephen Nelson created it. Stephen is the founder of crossbible.com, a web-based Bible study platform that includes an interactive version of the timeline of the Bible. Today, I'm going to use his chart in order to give you an introduction to New Testament textual criticism. By the way, if you want to get a copy of this chart as a poster, you can do so by going to crossbible.com or by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. But take note, this video is not actually sponsored by CrossBible, nor am I getting a cut from any of the sales. I simply like the chart and was given permission to use it for this video. Before we begin, I'll point out that this chart does also cover textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, aka the Old Testament. However, most of it is focused on the New Testament, and it is therefore that part that I'll be covering today. So the first thing I need to explain to you is what all the different colors mean. Basically, each colored square on this chart represents an existing copy or manuscript of the New Testament. Now, there are over 25,000 manuscripts, including tiny fragments, that predate the printing press. So obviously this chart doesn't show all of them. However, it does show all of the really important ones. As you can see, there are several different colors. Well, these represent various textual traditions or text types. The three main ones being Byzantine, shown in red, Alexandrian, shown in blue, and Western, shown in green. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on Christian history, you might remember me mentioning the Pentarchy. These were the 5 cities in the Roman Empire that became major centers of early Christianity. Well, as you can probably guess, the Byzantine text is associated with Constantinople, the Alexandrian text with Alexandria, and the Western text with Rome. Basically, in each one of these locations, different scribes were at work, and therefore over time, as more and more copies of the New Testament were made, keep in mind this all would have been done by hand, some slight differences emerged. Estimates put the approximate number of differences as high as 400,000. Sometimes these variations, called textual variants, were simply due to copying mistakes, whereas other times they were deliberate choices made for a number of different reasons, including stylistic considerations. Now, I should make it clear, though, that when it comes to these differences, most of them are relatively minor, and none of them impact the basics of Christian theology. But still, for Christians, the Bible is considered the Word of God, and therefore accuracy is very important. Also, regardless of whether you're Christian or non-Christian, well, trying to find out what the original was is certainly an interesting puzzle, and one that is intertwined with the history of the last 2,000 years. Again, if you know your Christian history, you'll know that these three areas were conquered by Islam in the 7th century. And then during the 11th century, the remaining two centers of Christianity parted ways, with this one becoming the Roman Catholic Church and this one becoming the Eastern Orthodox Church. So in terms of text types, the two dominant ones for many centuries were the Western type and the Byzantine type. Let's look at the Western tradition first. The oldest manuscript fragment traditionally assigned to the so-called Western tradition is P104. The P stands for papyrus because that's the material it was written on. If we look at the timeline shown at the bottom, we can see that scholars date P104 to the 2nd century, meaning that it was probably created sometime between 100 and 200 AD. So that's pretty early. However, P104 is just one small fragment, containing just a few verses from Matthew chapter 21. The earliest, mostly complete Greek manuscripts we have for this textual tradition are these two, Codex Bezae from the 5th century, which contains all 4 Gospels plus Acts, and Codex Claromontanus from the 6th century, which contains the Pauline epistles. Codices like these ones are actual books rather than just single pages, and they were made out of parchment rather than papyrus. Anyhow, when we compare these two manuscripts to those from other text types, what we find is that scribes of the so-called Western tradition tended to paraphrase more often, changing things here and there so that the text flowed better. This means that, generally speaking, individual Western readings of the Greek New Testament can be slightly longer. However, this textual family also contains some striking omissions. So, in a few places, the Western wording is actually shorter than in other streams. One example can be seen in P104, which includes Matthew chapter 21, verses 43 and 45, but not verse 44. Since the Western Church worshipped in Latin, they produced many Latin translations of the New Testament, which generally match the version of the Greek text found in this so-called Western cluster. The most famous of these Latin versions is the Vulgate, translated by St. Jerome. It was produced in the late 4th century. Jerome's own copy no longer exists, but several later witnesses to the Vulgate include the 5th century Codex Sangallensis and the 6th century Codex Valdensis, while the earliest complete copy we have of it, Codex Amiantinus, dates to the 8th century. Versions of the Latin New Testament that predate the Vulgate are known as Vetus Latina, which means Old Latin. The earliest manuscripts we have in this tradition run from the 4th to the early 5th centuries, including these three from around 400 AD. We also have several very old Syriac and Gothic versions of the New Testament that fall into the Western text type as well. These include Syriac Sinaiticus, which predates the Peshitta, or Standard Syriac version, as well as Codex Argentius, which is a Gothic Bible. Both of these date to the 4th century, and therefore what this means is that when it comes to the so-called Western text type, we actually have Syriac, Gothic, and Latin manuscripts that are older than the oldest Greek manuscripts in the tradition. Now, because medieval England was a part of the Catholic Church, the earliest English translations we have of the New Testament were all based on the Latin Vulgate, and hence are a part of the Western text tradition. The oldest example is the Lindisfarne Gospels. These were created in Latin in England in the early 8th century. However, in the 10th century, a monk added an Old English translation in between the original lines. Later, in the 14th century, John Wycliffe used the Vulgate to translate the Bible into Middle English. And then, in the early 17th century, scholars in what is now France translated the Vulgate into Modern English, creating the Douay-Rheims Bible. This version was revised in 1752 by a bishop named Richard Challoner. And up until the 1970s, his version of the Douay Rheims was the main Bible used by English-speaking Catholics around the world. Nowadays, there's also the Jerusalem Bible and the New American Bible, both of which are ultimately based on the critical text, which I'll be explaining a bit later. Okay, the last thing I'll point out in this green Western text type section is the Nova Vulgata, or New Vulgate, which is the official Latin version of the Bible used by the Catholic Church today. It was produced in 1979 based on the 16th century Sixto-Clementine Vulgate, which was produced after the famous Gutenberg Bible, the very first book to be printed using a modern printing press. Let's now take a look at the Byzantine text type, which includes all of the red boxes on this chart. As you can see here, the Byzantine text is also referred to as the majority text. That's because roughly 90% of New Testament manuscripts in Greek are of this type, which makes sense considering that they were produced by the Byzantines, who spoke Greek. There aren't any early papyrus fragments that fit into this text type, probably because Constantinople didn't become the capital of the Eastern Empire until the 4th century. So the earliest substantial Byzantine witness is actually from a full codex, the Codex Alexandrinus, dating to the 5th century. The reason it's shown in purple is because it's of a mixed type. Basically, the Gospels are Byzantine, and the rest of the New Testament is Alexandrian. The next oldest examples of the Byzantine text type are these uncials, made in the 6th century. The word uncial, also known as majuscule, refers to the fact that the text is written in rounded, all-capital letters. These particular ones were also all written on parchment that had been dyed purple, with the lettering being done in either gold or silver ink. Codex Rosanensis stands out because it's one of the earliest examples of an illuminated manuscript, meaning that the text was embellished with pictures and other decorations. Eventually, uncial manuscripts gave way to minuscule manuscripts, which are those written in a cursive lowercase script. An early example is minuscule 461, which is unique in that it also has a date written on it, 835 AD. You see, usually scribes didn't date their work. Instead, scholars have to figure out the date based on the material and writing style used. Between the year 1000 and the year 1500, lots of these Byzantine-type minuscules were made, and in fact, around 3000 still exist to this day. A handful of these late medieval minuscules are particularly important because they are the ones that the Dutch author Erasmus used to create his version of the New Testament in the 16th century. Erasmus lived during the time of the Protestant Reformation, and later revisions of his Greek New Testament ended up becoming known as the Textus Receptus, which means the received text. Basically, it was considered the standard version of the Greek New Testament until the late 19th century, especially by Protestants. See all these red boxes with black text from 1500 to 1900? Well, all of them are ultimately based on Erasmus's work, and therefore all of them fall under the Byzantine text type. Most notable is the King James Version, produced in 1611. To this day, there are some English-speaking Christians who consider the KJV to be the only accurate Bible translation available in English. Their argument is that God guided Erasmus and others in the Byzantine tradition, including the developers of the KJV, in the same way that God guided the original authors of the New Testament. Whereas when it comes to more recent translations, well, God didn't guide those. But it wasn't just English translations that Erasmus influenced. You can see down here that his work influenced many modern Greek versions and many other international translations as well. One last thing I'll point out in this red Byzantine section is this box, which differs from the rest in that it has gold text. This represents the patriarchal text, which today is the official version of the Bible used by the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay, let's now take a look at the third major text type, the so-called Alexandrian text. Because Alexandria was only a predominantly Christian city for about 200 years, most of the copies of the New Testament from this region were lost. However, the dry conditions in Egypt preserved things really well, and during the 19th and 20th centuries, a bunch of really old manuscripts resurfaced, including papyri 46 and 75, which both date to around 200 AD. P46 is currently the oldest copy we have of the Pauline epistles, and P75 is the oldest copy we have of Luke. However, the most important Alexandrian manuscript found in recent times is Codex Sinaiticus, which was rediscovered in 1844 at a monastery in the Sinai Desert. It includes a complete copy of the New Testament, and it matches very closely to a codex held at the Vatican called Codex Vaticanus, which is also assigned to the Alexandrian text type. These two codices both date to the 4th century, which makes them about 100 years older than Codex Alexandrinus, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the oldest example we have of the Gospels written in the Byzantine text type. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are also about 100 years older than Codex Bezae, the oldest Greek codex we have from the Western tradition. Now, there are two key principles in textual criticism when it comes to deciding which versions of a text are more likely to be closer to the original. The first is, the older the variant, the better. This one's pretty obvious. Things get changed over time, so the closer you can get to when the original was written, the more likely you're going to get a version with the least amount of changes. So, since our earliest surviving manuscripts are traditionally assigned to the Alexandrian text type, while both Byzantine and Western witnesses tend to be later, this supports the conclusion that the Alexandrian text tends to be closer to the original. The second principle is, the shorter and sometimes more awkward sounding a textual variant is, the more likely it is to reflect the original wording. You see, if a scribe comes across a text that is unclear, they might be tempted to tidy things up a bit. Change the wording or paraphrase it so that it makes more sense. This usually leads to more words, not less. Again, overall, the Alexandrian text type tends to be shorter, and it is more likely to contain passages that are difficult. This is further evidence that the Alexandrian text is usually closer to the original. So, starting in the late 19th century, there was a shift away from relying on the Textus Receptus for making English Bible translations, and instead relying more on critical editions of the Greek New Testament that favored the Alexandrian text type. This is why there's a noticeable change on the chart here, with the red squares being replaced by blue squares. One of the earliest modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament, using all of the recently found Alexandrian manuscripts, was the one made by two men named Westcott and Hort. This was then followed by the work of Eberhard Nestle and his successors, which include his son Erwin Nestle, as well as the husband-wife team of Kurt and Barbara Alland. Their version of the Greek New Testament, commonly known as the Nestle-Aland text, is considered by most biblical scholars these days to be the most accurate, and it was the one used in the creation of the ESV, NRSV, NIV, and most other modern Bible translations. Currently, it is in its 28th edition, with the 29th expected sometime this year. Take note that it is shown in a black box instead of blue to indicate that it is an eclectic text. This means that rather than adhering rigidly to the Alexandrian text type only, it makes use of every manuscript available, including a few that are labeled as unknown in terms of text type. If we go back to the beginning of the timeline, we can see that there are several of these early on, many of them mere fragments. For example, Papyrus 52 is probably the oldest fragment of the New Testament ever found, often dated as early as 125 AD. This credit card-sized fragment doesn't have enough material to be confidently assigned to a text type. Another very early manuscript is Papyrus 66, which is the oldest nearly complete copy of the Gospel of John. It is broadly Alexandrian, but it also has some mixed readings, and therefore it is often put in the eclectic unknown category as well. The same is true of Codex Washingtoniensis, which dates to around 400 AD and is currently housed at the Smithsonian, making it the oldest copy of the four Gospels located in the US. Okay, now in addition to the Western, Byzantine, and Alexandrian text types, there's actually also a fourth potential text type that is shown on this chart as well. I didn't mention it earlier because it's more controversial, and there are no known manuscripts in this type until the 9th century. Anyhow, it's the so-called Caesarean text type, named after the city of Caesarea near Jerusalem, and it is shown on this chart in yellow as well as in orange in cases where it is mixed with the Byzantine type. Now, so far, I haven't actually given you any examples of any of the differences found between the three main text types. Like I say, most of the differences are quite minor, often just word order or spelling that's only visible in the Greek. For example, take Matthew chapter 2, verse 17. The Alexandrian version reads, "Then what was said through Jeremiah was fulfilled." But the Byzantine version reads, "Then what was said by Jeremiah was fulfilled." So just one little word is different, and it doesn't really impact the meaning of the verse. But take a look at the Western version. It reads, "Then what was said by the Lord through Jeremiah was fulfilled." So here's a good example of the Western text type expanding things to make sure that everyone understands that it was God who said it, but that God said it through Jeremiah. Since the Alexandrian version is likely the original, that's the version that you'll find in most modern Bibles. And the vast majority of textual differences are like this one. There are, however, a few differences that are a bit more consequential. Let me share with you the three that are probably the most important. The first is Mark chapter 16, which is the final chapter in that gospel. In our two earliest complete manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the chapter ends with verse 8. Basically, the women discover Jesus' empty tomb, where an angel tells them that Jesus has risen. But they don't actually see Jesus. The book simply ends with the line, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." However, in most later copies, especially in the Byzantine tradition, the chapter has 12 more verses. In these extra verses, Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene and then to his 11 disciples. So, in the Textus Receptus, as well as in translations based on it, such as the King James Version, Mark chapter 16 has 20 verses. However, because textual critics widely regard the long ending of Mark as a later addition, most modern Bible translations now end Mark with verse 8 and include the longer ending in brackets with a special note. A similar situation can be found in the Gospel of John, from chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. This section is known as the Pericope Adulterae, and it contains the story of the adulterous woman who is brought before Jesus. Jesus writes something in the sand and then asks the women's accusers which one of them is without sin. No one can say that they are, so they all leave. Again, this section is not found in most early versions, but it is in most of the later Byzantine sources and in a good share of the Western copies. So that's yet another 12 verses that have been placed in brackets in most Bibles. Finally, there's the Johannine comma in 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Let me read these to you in the King James, which is based on the Textus Receptus. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood. And these three agree in one. This is one of the clearest examples of the Trinity being mentioned in a single verse, although there are others. However, based on the earliest Greek witnesses, including Alexandrian manuscripts and Latin Vulgate copies, these verses likely originally read, "For there are three that bear record, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one." So, according to most scholars, the part about the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost was probably added later. Okay, so that was an introduction to New Testament textual criticism using this amazing new chart by Stephen Nelson at Cross Bible. Again, if you want to get a copy for yourself, you can head over to crossbible.com or just click the link in the description or pinned comment. Thanks for watching.